park on 24, move your car.
Come on, talk to me.
Impact that this sentence, this crime has had on Laquan McDonald and his family. You've seen
hundreds still gathering with calls for an even bigger rally tomorrow at the police station.
Do you have a knife or a gun there?
Number 5. Adam Toledo. On March 29, 2021, Adam Toledo, a 13-year-old Latino-American boy, was fatally shot by Chicago Police Department officer Eric Stillman in the Little Village neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. According to police, officers were responding to reports of shots fired in the area when they encountered Toledo and another person.
Sally, need an ambulance, got a gunshot victim. Shots fired by the police.
By the police. We'll get an ambulance rolling.
Somebody bring the medical kit now.
Okay, can someone send the medical? Ambulance 34 is rolling over there to Sawyer, guys.
When the officers approached the pair, Toledo reportedly ran away. An officer pursued him on foot, and as Toledo turned toward the officer fired one shot, striking him in the chest. Toledo was later pronounced deceased at the scene. Body camera footage of the incident was released by the Chicago Police Department, sparking outrage and protests. The video showed Toledo with his hands raised, appearing to drop a gun before he was shot by the officer. Stillman shot at the boy less than a second after he dropped the gun. In March 2022, authorities announced there would be no criminal charges brought against the officer involved in the slaying of Toledo.
No charges have been filed against the officer, who's been placed on administrative duty.
And that's a case where jurors, where grand jurors, where prosecutors, and where COPA are much more.
If you look at that and listen to what is going on, he is following the directions of the police officer.
At this time, if Roman will be released or if he will sit behind bars until that Skokie case is brought before it.
Number 4. Laquan McDonald. Laquan McDonald was just 17 years old when he was shot and slain by Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke on October 20, 2014. The incident, which was captured on police dashcam footage, showed McDonald walking down the street holding a small knife before being shot 16 times by Van Dyke, who had arrived on the scene moments earlier.
It's the shame. The family are suffering a tremendous amount of pain during this.
Alan and Cheryl Van Dyke is scheduled to be released on February 3rd after serving a little less than 3 years and 4 months.
Prayer is that Mr. Van Dyke comes out a different man than when he went in.
October of 2014, Van Dyke and his partner responded to a call about a man with a knife.
Obligation to file federal civil rights charges on Jason Van Dyke.
The slaying of Laquan McDonald sparked widespread outrage and protests in Chicago and across the country, as it raised questions about the use of excessive force by police and the failure of the justice system to hold officers accountable for their actions. The dashcam footage of the shooting was released more than a year after the incident, following a court order, and showed a stark contrast to the initial police report, which claimed that McDonald had lunged at officers with the knife. The footage showed that McDonald was walking away from the officers when he was shot, and that Van Dyke continued to fire even after McDonald had fallen to the ground. The shooting of Laquan McDonald ultimately led to the indictment of Van Dyke on charges of first-degree slaying and aggravated battery. He was convicted of second-degree slaying and 16 counts of aggravated battery and was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months in prison. Number 3. Michael Brown. On August 9, 2014, the city of Ferguson, Missouri was forever changed when an unarmed black teenager named Michael Brown was shot and slain by a white police officer named Darren Wilson. The incident, which took place in broad daylight on a busy street, shocked the community and ignited a firestorm of protests and unrest that spread across the country. Eyewitness accounts of what happened that day vary, but what is clear is that Brown was shot multiple times by Wilson, who claimed he was acting in self-defense. The incident took place just minutes after Wilson confronted Brown and his friend, Dorian Johnson, for walking in the middle of the street. Wilson encountered Brown and his friend as they were walking in the middle of the street. Wilson ordered the two young men to move to the sidewalk, and an altercation ensued. Eyewitness accounts of what happened next vary, but it is undisputed that Wilson fired multiple shots at Brown, who was unarmed at the time. Brown was hit several times and perished at the scene. The officer involved in the shooting, Darren Wilson, was initially placed on administrative leave while an investigation was conducted. In November 2014, a grand jury decided not to indict Wilson, sparking further protests and civil unrest.
Body towards this way, hands in the air, being compliant. He gets shot in his face and chest.
Those last seconds, did he charge or did he put his hands up? Should have been enough to send this to trial.
Struggle over the officer's weapon. There was at least one shot fired within the car. I appreciate that it took a very long time yesterday to process this.
The Department of Justice conducted its own investigation into the shooting and released a scathing report in March 2015, which found that the Ferguson Police Department had engaged in a pattern of racial bias and excessive use of force. The report also concluded that Wilson had acted in self-defense when he shot Brown. Despite the controversy surrounding the shooting, it was clear that the slaying of Michael Brown was a tragedy that exposed deep-seated issues of racial injustice. It only infuriated people further when the police officer involved was allowed to escape justice. Number 2, Tony Robinson. On March 6, 2015, Tony Robinson, a 19-year-old African-American, was shot and slain by a white police officer named Matt Kenny in Madison, Wisconsin. The police received reports that 19-year-old Tony Robinson was yelling and jumping in front of cars. Robinson had reportedly been running in and out of the street while shouting at bystanders. Some of the reports were from friends of Robinson who were concerned by his erratic behavior and called for help. The original caller and witnesses all stated that Robinson was unarmed and expressed concern over his well-being. 45-year-old officer Matt Kenny responded to the call to check person, and Kenny was backed up by Sergeant Gary and Officer Christian. Kenny encountered Robinson at the top of the stairs, who punched Kenny in the head, causing Kenny to sustain a concussion. Kenny said he feared for his life, thinking he could be knocked down the stairs and have his weapon taken, and fatally shot Robinson.
That a disturbance was taking place on the street. As officers raced to the scene, they were told additional calls were coming across the street from the gas station. You can see the police cars here. This is the house where it happened. Officer Kenny went up.
I heard just rustling and things being knocked over and shots.
You heard the gunshots?
Yes.
And how many did you hear?
Can't wait for this to last forever. You know, the next person could lose their life while we're waiting and while we're
fast-tracked. Let's actually look at that policy. Let's see what MPD is doing or not doing.
The Robinsons' estate's description of the events alleges that Kenny was dispatched to a check person call, knew that he should wait for backup, but entered the building with his weapon drawn anyway. They further stated that Robinson fell down the stairs and Kenny fired the fatal shots as he lay helpless at the bottom of the stairs. The aftermath of the shooting was highly controversial, with eyewitness accounts and police reports providing conflicting information about what happened. Some witnesses claimed that Robinson was unarmed and had his hands up when he was shot, while others argued that he was behaving erratically and posed a threat to the officer's safety. In the weeks following the shooting, protests and rallies were held throughout Madison and across the country, calling for justice for Tony Robinson and for an end to police violence against people of color. In May 2015, the Dane County District Attorney's Office announced that it would not be pursuing criminal charges against Officer Kenny, sparking further outrage and demonstrations. Number 1, Antoine Rose II. Antoine Rose II was a gifted student. His life ended before his time because of the actions of one racist cop. Officer Michael Rosfeld had previously been employed as a university cop at the University of Pittsburgh. During his time as a university cop, there have been claims that Officer Rosfeld used his power to perform false arrests, attack individuals, as well as falsifying records. Officer Rosfeld was released quietly from the university to avoid any red flags on his record, which could have possibly prevented him from obtaining future employment.
Very difficult in smaller communities, hey, in larger communities for police to police the police.
Will enable a police officer to be held accountable the same
involved in deadly shootings in the hands of the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office.
Bringing implicit bias, particularly in favor of law enforcement officers.
Officer Michael Rosfeld had been sworn into the East Pittsburgh Police Department hours prior to taking the life of Antoine Rose II. On June 19, 2018, sometime around 8:30 p.m., a drive-by shooting occurred in North Braddock, Pennsylvania. Approximately 10 minutes later, a silver Chevrolet Cruze was pulled over in East Pittsburgh for a traffic stop and for matching the description of the vehicle used in the earlier drive-by shooting. The vehicle consisted of 3 people: the driver, Antoine Rose, and Zywan Hester. The police officers involved in the stop took note of the bullet holes on the exterior of the car. Based on video footage filmed on a bystander's cell phone, Antoine Rose II was sat in the passenger seat, was wearing a white shirt, and attempted to run away from the scene. As he was running, the video shows Officer Rosfeld shooting after Rose 3 times. William Ross, who was the victim of the drive-by shooting, came forth and claimed that Rose had been the one to fire the gun at him due to personal disagreements the two had been having. Video surveillance of the drive-by shooting posted by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette contradicted Ross's statements and showed backseat passenger Zywan Hester, who was wearing a dark-colored shirt, firing the gun at Ross.
We always wanted to respect the public's First Amendment rights to protest, but at the same time, we had to mind you protesting that there's certain intersections, accesses to the parkway, access to the hospital. A short period of time, we can do it, and we can set up the logistics a lot faster.
When first questioned, Officer Rosfeld claimed that he believed Rose was armed and shot after him to protect himself. When questioned a second time, Officer Rosfeld stated that Rose was not in fact armed. These discrepancies in statements created a stir in the public and pushed forth a multitude of protests demanding justice for Antoine Rose and his family. Unfortunately, no justice was to come. Even after the investigation and trial, the jury finalized their verdict in less than 3 hours and found Rosfeld not guilty of first and third degree slaying and neither involuntary slaying. That's all for today, folks. See you next time.